Hello, everyone out there in YouTube land, I guess is the way to say that. This will be November the 9th, Sunday morning, and we're going to be talking about Psalm 3 today. And I've entitled the lesson, Trusting God When Everything Seems Uncertain. And it's a terribly important lesson because of what's going on right now in the world. So in our world, there's a great amount of upheaval and uncertainty. We've got communism taking over in New York and among our younger people that have been misled through our higher education, our universities and all that have perverted our actual history of this nation and of the desire that we have for freedom, and how the Muslim community is wanting to take over in a militaristic type way. And they're doing that even through the Democratic Party right now that's being controlled by them. And so there's a lot of turmoil and a lot of shaking that's going on. God has always allowed turmoil and shaking to come upon his people. It's a time when God is sifting out, even as we speak, the wheat from the chaff. It's a time when, through testing and through shaking, those individuals that are not really his people are shown for who they are. Now, I'm going to tell you a story about a group of Christians that were meeting in a Muslim held country. I won't name the name, but in a Muslim held country. And their meeting was in violation of the Muslim law. And so, as a result, they were kind of meeting in secret, and there was not a very big group of them. But on one Sunday morning when they were meeting for church, the banging on the door, and a couple of soldiers came in carrying guns, and they walked in, and basically they made an announcement that if there were people there that were believers in Jesus Christ, and you really had faith in the fact that about who Jesus is, and you trusted in Jesus, then you stay put. But those of you that don't really believe in him, you go ahead and get out of here and you'll be fine. And so people looked around at one another for a minute or two, and about half of them got up and left. And it left a smaller group there. And after everyone was out, the soldiers set down their rifles and says, now that we've got rid of the imposters, the people that aren't really Christians, now we are your brothers. We want to worship with you this morning. And that's exactly what happened. So it was a shaking that occurred right there that morning that really showed which ones were going to stand for Jesus and which ones weren't. And so when the chips are really down, I think in most churches, there's people that you think are really Christians, you're going to find out aren't. They're cowards. They're not really going to stand for Jesus when the chips are down. And those that are, you may not think that they are right now, but when the chips are down, they'll prove what they really are. And that's exactly what tribulation does. That's what shaking does. And so if we read about God's judgments, there have always been God's judgments. Psalm 3 is a time when we're going to read about the man David, and we're going to read about what David went through. I'll go back and give you a little bit of history. In order to get this done, if you read 2 Samuel chapters 13 through 18, you're going to read about David's family. And let's just say that David had a lot of turmoil in his family. He had a son named Amnon, and he had another son from another woman named Absalom. And Absalom had I guess a very beautiful sister named Tamar. And Amnon, a half brother to Absalom and Tamar, devised a plan. You can read about it if you read those chapters, devised a plan about, he said he loved her. He couldn't hardly stand not to have her. And so he acted like he was sick so that he could go to his bed, and he asked David to let Tamar come over there and make a meal for him and feed him. And when she came over there to do that as a special favor to Amnon, Amnon drove all the servants out of the place. And when Tamar got close to him, he grabbed her, pulled her into the bed, and raped her. And anyway, then he rejected her, said he hated her after he had done that. He hated her more than he had loved her before, is what it says. And so she says, you can't do this to me like that. She begged him not to do it in the first place, and he wouldn't do it. He just went ahead and forcibly placed himself on her. And anyway, so she ripped her clothes and put ashes on her head, and she went out of there, and she went to her brother Absalom and told her brother what Amnon had done, and Absalom hated his brother for that. As a matter of fact, he kept planning on what he was going to do to get him back. And a couple of years later, goes on. So this guy had been planning this for a long time. He invited David's sons, a bunch of them, over for a feast. He invited them over for a feast, but his intent was to make sure Amnon was there. And sure enough, Absalom killed Amnon because he had raped his sister Tamar. And then Absalom, instead of sticking around in Jerusalem, he headed for the high ground, and he left. He's gone a couple of years. And anyway, David loved Absalom, and he mourned the loss of his son Amnon. I think it was the older brother was Amnon. And he wanted Absalom to come back, but he said, he didn't really want to see him. What he'd done really deserved death. But David didn't want to kill him. Absalom, and he loved Absalom, but he did let him come back to live in Jerusalem. He said, but he can never come before me. Anyway, time goes on. And you read a little bit later on in those chapters, and it's a really interesting read. I would highly recommend that you read it. But a little bit later on, we find that Absalom, he sets himself out at the gate, or as people were coming in and out. They would come to the king to get judgments about grievances that they had, maybe land grievances or whatever they were, and David would make judgments among the people. Well, Absalom would meet them, and he'd ask them what was going on, and they'd tell him, and he'd say, if I were the judge, if I was a king, let me tell you how, and he always sided with the people with the grievances. And he says, this is the way I take care of it. Well, David didn't necessarily side with all the people like that. But what he was trying to do was curry favor with all the multitudes that were coming in and out of Jerusalem. And boy, did he do it. He did just that. Well, anyway, there comes a time, David's getting a little bit older. There comes a time, though, that Absalom says, okay, I've got enough people on my side. I'm going to take the kingdom over. And so he gathers up a bunch of people, and it looks like they're going to overthrow David's kingdom, run David out of town, and Absalom was going to take over. Well, we know what happened. Absalom did try to do that, and David, when he heard that he was coming with a multitude of people to kill him, he had to flee out of Jerusalem to save his life. But he still had a loyal following, David did, of people that would follow him. And so here he is fleeing out of the countryside. And now I want to read to you Psalm 3. Psalm 3, verse 1. A psalm of David. I call this thing again, trusting God when everything seems uncertain. There's some really strong lessons in here for us, if we'll think about it, because there are times when everything seems uncertain in our lives. That happens probably more than once. And if you haven't seen it yet, you are about to see it. I believe that we're right now in the beginning of a tribulation that's going to make everything seem so uncertain that if you don't have the kind of faith David exhibits here in Psalm 3, you will not stand. You'll be running out the door to save your life instead of being a real Christian. And that sifting of wheat from chaff is going to occur. And it's not only just occurred just occurring now. It's occurred several times. It typically does in every generation. Psalm 3 verse 1, a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. He said, Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Because Absalom had raised up half the nation just about to follow after him to make him king. Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, you are a shield around me. You're my glory. You're the one who lifts my head high. You know, when you feel dejected and rejected and down in the dumps and disappointed, typically you hang your head down. But David, because of his complete confidence in God, he didn't exhibit himself like that. He held his head high. Why? Because of his confidence in God. God was his sustainer. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep and wake again because the Lord sustains me. Imagine being persecuted and then not knowing if you're going to be killed in the next minute or two or what's going to happen, and you're able to sleep peacefully. Imagine that. Well, that's exactly what David's expressing here. I will not fear though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Arise, Lord, deliver me. My God, strike all my enemies on the jaw, break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance, David says. May your blessing be on your people. So David's exhibiting a huge amount of confidence in the Lord at a time when he was trouble and turmoil in David's house, fleeing out of Jerusalem, being on the run, having to leave his beloved capital city of Jerusalem and become a fugitive from his own son. Well, when it seems like you have fallen from God's favor, that's the time to start remembering about not just this psalm, but many other verses that tell us about the same things. Today we're going to examine the moment in the life of King David found in Psalm 3. Now this psalm emerges from a time of deep turmoil, like I said. He's fled from Jerusalem to escape the wrath of his own son Absalom at a time, if you were to think about it, having to leave your house, flee for your life, being on the run, you would think maybe God's not with me anymore. Maybe God, through whatever means, I can't really rely upon God because look at what all's happening. If you only look at the circumstances of a troubled time in your life, maybe when the government is falling or when the economic situation seems bleak, maybe you've lost your job, you don't know if you're going to lose your house. When things really, really look bleak, you'd say, if God were really for me, I wouldn't be going through all this stuff. Well, that's not necessarily true, and David understood that. Yet, if you look through all this thing, David's faith, his confidence in who really is his deliverer, even though appearances would seem like God may have turned against him, he trusted in his God. Consider how easy it would have been for him to conclude that God had abandoned him and stripped him of his kingdom. Now let's explore this psalm. David begins by acknowledging the very real threats against him. He says, "O Lord, how many are my foes, my enemies? How many of these people are rising up against me? Many are saying to me, God's not going to save him this time." Well, David doesn't shy away from the truth of his situation, and sometimes the best thing we can do is sit down and evaluate what are the particulars of what I'm going through right now. What am I facing right now? So he recognizes the multitude of his enemies. He recognizes his situation. He recognizes the fact that it's his own son that's doing it. So often when we face overwhelming challenges, it will cause us to question our standing with God. If God really is for me, if I was under God's favor, this shouldn't be happening to me. So it's important to be honest and to honestly assess whatever's going on in our life at the time. Now we can think it's everything's falling apart and everything may seem like it is. Yet, if we really do acknowledge our situation, we understand that every child of God goes through the same thing. Now listen to this. I want to give you a couple of scriptures. The Bible says in James chapter 1, is blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. Having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. In the book of Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 26, he talks about a shaking that happens in the earth, and that this shaking is going to reveal who his children really are. Hebrews 12, 26 through 29, and God is a consuming fire. In the book of James, in the book of Peter, we find that the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God. And if it first began at us, what will be the end of those who obey not the gospel? And another passage in James chapter 1, it says, we need to count it all joy when we fall under trials of many kinds, knowing that it's the proving of our faith that brings about what God's looking for in our lives. In Hebrews 12, we're told that there's not any son, no child of his, there's none that will not endure chastening. And God chastens every legitimate son that he receives. And so this chastening that you may be going through is for your own good if you look at it through eyes of faith, like God tells us that we're to do, like David did when he was going through his trials. So our confidence is to be not in our own wits in what's going on there, and not to necessarily question what God is doing in our lives. It's to understand that God does this for every true believer. But David said in Psalm 3:3, but you, Lord, are a shield around me. You're my glory. You're the one who lifts my head high. Here David, he shifts his focus from the enemies that he has, and despite the chaos surrounding him, declares that God is his shield. A shield is a protective device that keeps you from being eternally harmed. Doesn't mean that you can't undergo some very hard circumstances, but these hard circumstances are what tests our legitimate faith in God. When we feel abandoned, we need to remember that God is our defender, and we can lift our heads high even when otherwise they would be held low in despair. So David said in Psalm 3 and verse 4, I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. At times, the darkest times in our life, that is the time to pray, to go to God in prayer, and remember that God, he hears and he answers the prayers of his righteous ones. And so if we're feeling dejected from God, it's probably because we've got a completely wrong attitude about who God is and what God is doing in our life. So call out, allow God to answer, and look for his answer. David understood the importance of prayer. And so in the midst of his distress, he called out to God, understood that God would hear him, and that God would fulfill his prayer in his lifetime. So there's power in bringing our fears and our anxieties before God. David's prayer is a declaration of faith, a belief that even in the darkest hour, God will listen and God does respond. When we cry out, we're signaling our reliance upon God, affirming our belief that God is active in our lives and is engaged in our lives. So that's how we find peace. The Bible says in everything that we need to pray. And the peace that passes all understanding will guard our hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Another passage, Psalm 23. Even though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we don't have to fear any evil. Why? Because it's God who's with us. His rod and his staff are what comforts us. And so understand, every child of God has got to go through the deep, dark valley. There are times when it may seem like God Maybe I've lost the favor of God. If you look at it that way, you'll probably fail. If you look at your own frailties and insignificance, then you'll probably fail. You'll run out of the door trying to save your life in this life. And anyone who wants to save their life here will lose it eternally, Jesus said. So David again says in verse 5 that he can lay down and sleep because it's the Lord who sustains him. So when everything seems desperate, in turmoil, in our lives, if we feel the weight of the circumstances, it may suggest that we've fallen from God's favor, but we can still find rest and peace and comfort in His presence. I always found out that when I was really upset about things, when I really prayed and I really gave it into God's hands, there was a sense of peace that would come upon me. And if I hadn't gotten there, then I hadn't really handed it over to God. I was trying to bear it all myself. And I think a lot of us do the same thing. So we try to bear our own burdens, and it will weigh us down to nothing. It'll make us feel so dejected and so heavy that we don't even feel like getting out of bed of a morning. So we can't do that. Go to God. Jesus said, "Bring your burdens to Him." He'll take on your burdens in the book of Matthew. So I'll not fear though tens of thousands assail me on every side. It'll be God that delivers me. He's my God. David's faith culminates in a declaration of trust. He acknowledges that regardless of the odds against him, he will not be afraid. His confidence is rooted in God's ability, not his own, in God's ability to deliver him. David calls upon the Lord to rise up and save him, a reminder that our victory does not rest in our own strength, but in God's might. Even when it appears that we've fallen from favor, God remains the ultimate source of our victory. So we too, like David, are called to put our trust in God, knowing that He fights for us. In moments of despair, we can confidently proclaim our faith in His ability to deliver us from our trials. So here's our conclusion. As we reflect on Psalm 3 and the faith of David in his darkest hours, we're reminded that in our dark circumstances of life, it does not necessarily mean that we are out of God's favor. Even when it feels as though we've fallen from grace, we can find hope and strength in God's protection, presence, and promise of victory. So we need to take heart in this truth and understand that what God is doing is shaking out those individuals that aren't really committed to Him. And so when the test comes, when the time has come for judgment to begin at the house of God, when we're going through, I believe, the beginning of a great tribulation, many people who thought they were faithful Christians will find out they don't really have the kind of faith that David had in Psalm 3. What kind of faith do you have? Are you going to trust the Lord in your dark times of your life? Or are you going to give up and run out the door? The choice is always before us. And those individuals who are genuinely Christians, who really trust in the power of Christ, will be exposed for who they are. And shown for who they are. And those who really don't have faith will be exposed for the illegitimacy of their faith. They claim to be Christians, but are they really? The lesson's yours.